In this session, we learn about initiatives in Europe. First, Dr. Verbovszky made a presentation. He used the phrase German structural pacifism. So it challenges or constraints within Germany and how those constraints are affected the wargaming culture in Germany. And based on that understanding, but recently things has changed in recent years. It began as a grassroots level, and wargaming is rising very rapidly in recent years. And I think his presentation gave a lot of important insights for Japan. Now, next presenter was Dr. Sörenson. Between game players, misconception or miscalculation happens, and by using a game, we can visualize those misconceptions or miscalculations, because this miscalculation between states or actors usually lead to war. It's at least one of the causes of war, and it can be reproduced through war gaming, and that was an important point, I think, in his presentation. And the purpose or question for the wargaming have to be defined explicitly, and because that will help to meet the meaning in terms of education or policy making. It makes it more relevant by having clearly defined purposes. And before getting questions from the audience, as a facilitator, I'd like to ask common questions to the two scholars. In session 1, AI-based use of AI for policy simulation or for wargaming was a theme in session 1. And the two experts in session 2 does wargaming from academic perspective. So from your point of view, using AI for wargaming or policy simulation, what kind of meaning do you see, or what kind of challenges do you see in using AI for policy simulation or wargaming from your perspective? And you have done simulations of wargamings, and have you ever used AI in past war games? And if you could share such examples, if any, to the extent it is possible, because in the demo rooms, the two presenters here who presented in session 1 are not here to attend to the exhibition or the breakout rooms, so you can be very honest about the use of AI. Let me start with Dr. Sörenson.
Thank you, HARADA-san. Well, I think at FOI we have worked with AI and wargaming, and I think with mixed results. It's often like that when you bring a new technology online. The community needs time to adapt, and you need to understand what you're actually going to use the technology for. I think what was interesting in the previous presentation was that there were good examples. I mean, because one was presenting basically analytical games where you sort of data mine heavily, whereas the other one was more actually using AI for pedagogic reasons. I think both these avenues are interesting. I think FOI has mainly looked into it for analytical purposes. A huge problem for us is, of course, that it's open AI and open source code, open large language models. The Swedish engineers are never going to allow us to bring that in. So we're going to have to use platforms outside of the agency, servers outside the agency, strictly for research purposes. We're not allowed to bring it into the agency to conduct sort of real war games with real decision makers. That's a problem, but we develop our own AI systems within FOI. So I think over the years, this is going to be less of a problem. But that is the security aspect. I think it's inevitably a huge challenge with AI, and you have to be mindful of it in every step of the way. At least that's what I understand from our AI researchers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Verbovszky, please.
So when it comes to AI and wargaming, I think I should mention that the German definition of wargaming focuses exclusively on human decision-making. So this provides actually a pretty good way of separating between simulation, which would be the use of AI, and wargaming, which doesn't use AI. However, you can mix the methods, but having this separation allows us to kind of isolate better what questions we're asking. So one of the projects that I worked on, because I also am a fellow at the Defense AI Observatory at the Helmut Schmidt University, and that's the one of the projects, Ghost Play, is actually the one that funds both the Wargaming Center and the Defense AI Observatory, was the use of AI software for tactical decision-making. And there are some reports online about that. That was actually quite successful. It was able to develop its own tactics. So the AI developed its own tactics, and we used it to play against each other. So the one AI controlled the air defense systems, the other one controlled the drones, and these are already highly automated systems as it is. So this was sort of a logical next step. At the strategic level, we have, I'm going to use the word, played around with wargaming. We haven't done experiments yet where we can get reliable data, but we designed our own strategic level wargame, very unconventional design, but it's somewhat similar to a Matrix wargame. But we did that with the idea of it being AI ready, so we could use the AI both in an adjudicator role and in a player role. And our foreign ministry actually did an experiment with that and found it to be quite stable. So the AI actually played both the adjudicator and the players. And we simulated about 25 different actors in that case. So that is quite nice because we can use the same exact design for players. So we test the human decision-making, and we can do simulations, and then this will allow us to compare the results. So at the moment, this is still a little bit in development, but this should be, probably by next year, I'll be able to say more of how far we've made it there, but the initial results indicate that it's possible. So that's where we're at.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for, again, thought-provoking presentations. Deterrence is simple in theory, fiendishly complex and uncertain in practice, and practitioners cry out for guidance or even some kind of playbook for how to navigate deterrence, particularly in time of crisis. Now, it's relatively straightforward using analytical wargames and historical analysis to produce sort of lists of considerations that deterrence practitioners should bear in mind, or even options for deterrence. Much, much harder, though, to establish the criteria for selecting those options or knowing quite what the outcomes might be in a real-world situation. Ideally, you'd be able to advise practitioners in a kind of probabilistic language, and even if it's only 60-40, this option is more likely to succeed than fail. Karl, you mentioned how game theory is a good way of understanding and exploring probabilities. I wonder if you could comment on how kind of game theoretical constructs could be used to complement war games to sort of fill in that missing gap. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ollie. Yeah, I think maybe you didn't misspeak. So how can game theory complicate war games? I think that's also a possibility. Game theory has a tendency of going overboard with certain concepts and become very mathematical, and then it's only fun for the people who really liked algebra. But I think if you try to think of game theory less mathematically and more of what it is actually trying to do, it's trying to model the world, and it's trying to sort of focus it on a specific area. the wargaming world is much more messy. And I think that's in a sense the advantage of the wargame as well, that it is messy. So using those two as complements and trying to sort of data mine it more systematically, I think that is a good way to understand how we can sort of, what's the signal and the noise in the messiness of the wargame, and what's the problem with game theory, especially if you use classical game theory for actually capturing real-life situations. So they are sort of complementary to each other, but how to sort of merge them and map them onto each other, it is a bit of a challenge. And as you saw from my presentation, there is not, I don't have any definite answer, but I think there's clearly room there for more, and it's not surprising. I mean, in economics, you would do an experiment. You would basically set it up kind of similar to a war game or an analytical game, but you would be much more focused on what the results would mean for human behavior. You wouldn't really care about the outcome of the situation. If it goes to nuclear war directly, no one would care. They're just interested in what type of, how did this preference order for the player relate to how they managed to appraise the probability and then optimize the way they... That's what an economist would be interested in. And that's fine. So, however, it's not that far of a leap to go from sort of an economics experiment to an analytical war game. But we need to be mindful of how we take those steps. I think that's basically my conclusion from this. And I wish I had more time to be more of a researcher again. But I think maybe that's the junior generation at FY is going to have to pick up that thing. And hopefully I can sit on the sidelines and listen to what they come up with, because they're already much smarter than I am. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, yes, please. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I have a question to Dr. Verbovszky. You talked about the interagency cooperation, cooperation between agencies, or cooperation between different domain experts. That was very impressive. And I believe that this is very important. However, if you invite experts from different areas and expert areas to get the common understanding and common grounds for collaboration, sometimes that itself is a challenge. So on that point, is there anything that you are trying to do, you are doing, or is there any issues that you would like to raise in that respect?
That's a very good question, because it gets to a point that Germany in particular has a problem with, and that is we're quite stovepiped in the way that our ministries work. And so what we did was, one of the things we did in the game design for our sort of standard Foresight game was we play it anonymously. So we just invite the different participants, and we usually do not allow them to play their own role. So we make them play the role of other actors. So for example, if we invite the Foreign Office, the Defense Ministry, the Interior Ministry, the Chancellery, then we actually have them play each other rather than themselves. And we have them play it anonymously, and this helps create a change of perspective that actually trains interagency thinking, because they bring in their expertise from a specific ministry, but then they learn how to harness that from the perspective of a different ministry. And we've also done this at the local level. So we've actually done like a coordination, sort of national resilience game where we had the Chamber of Commerce, we had the Territorial Command of Berlin, we had a few different companies, the fire department and a few others, and then we sort of switched them around and had them play each other and try to accomplish their goals. And so they developed a sort of understanding of, well, what are the goals of the people I'm going to be talking to in the event of a crisis? And this seems to work out quite well. Also, the anonymity of the game seems to help, because they don't fall into the position of representing themselves. So then they start to really think of, how do I achieve the goals rather than how do I represent my organization appropriately. And there's often a conflict between that. So that is something that we've had a decent amount of success with so far.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions? Thank you very much. I have a question to Dr. Sörenson. A kind of overall question. If at FOI you do wargaming, I understand, and Sweden joined NATO, and there was a war in Ukraine, and that is changing the security situation in Europe. So against this backdrop, how wargaming is positioned in Sweden, did it change? And how it is used in Sweden, did it also change with these changing circumstances?
So thank you very much for the question. I think it did change, but in comparison to what Joseph told you about, it's not as drastically. So basically, wargaming was already present at FY, and we've been doing it for a long time. It's sort of been one of the a bit of a brand thing for our operational researchers to help the armed forces with. But now it's sort of, after the war in Ukraine, it leveled. So it increased almost exponentially. So now everyone is wargaming, to the point that we had to think more structurally of how to use the wargaming team in conjunction with other teams. Because one thing, and as I'm sure you have the same sort of challenges here at NIDS, that you have the ones who construct the game, and they're good for the general methodology of constructing the game, but then you also need subject matter experts who know Russia, who knows Ukraine. You need maybe some engineers for if you want to do something with weapons to explain yields and ranges of weapons. You might need, and then you might want to data mine it. And then you need some researchers with, I don't know, an economics or mathematical background to be present. If you have it computer aided, you're going to need something additional, maybe from the computer science people. So it tends to, the more complex you go, it tends to grow the resources needed. So I think one of the things we're trying to do now is a little bit what we did with nuclear weapons analysis, that we, within each sort of sector of FOI that works with something, so for instance space, they should have a designated couple of people who are good at subject matter experts on, for instance, Russian satellites, Chinese satellites, US satellites, Swedish, European satellites. And then if we need a red team, they can go and help the ones who know Russian security policy, etc., to build them together with some engineers from ballistics and some other people from my part where we do nuclear weapons. And that way we can sort of easier pull together people to give the subject matter, and it helps the constructor of the game a lot, because then they don't have to sit and read up on all the things. Otherwise, I mean, it's an impossible assignment otherwise for them. So that's how we're trying to solve it. But we don't really have issue. So if NIDS have a silver bullet, please tell us, and I'll be sure to get it over to Sweden as quickly as possible. But I also say, just on a sort of in parenthesis, the Swedish Defence University also do wargaming, and they do it more openly. A lot of what we do, we cannot display publicly, but they do it as part of the training for the officers, and they do it systematically, and and that's also a very established part that I was part of starting up in 2010. So there's various places within the Swedish defense system where you do wargaming, and those guys are also good. So it's a good complementary, and it's a good, like you have here at NIDS, that we can come and sit together and talk about these things. I think is very important, because if you only do like FY does it, then there's a risk that we get stuck with our own methodology. We only run the same games, and in the end you only get the same results. So I think that's why I'm also very thankful for this invitation, because I think it behooves us to speak more about how we play these games and what we can learn from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Thank you very much for great presentations. I have one question to Dr. Verbovszky. Last year, I joined Connections UK. And at that time, be it US or UK, hobby wargaming was being developed by public sector people, civilian people, and actually they provided services to military institutions who develop serious war games, or they become member of military and develop serious war games, including board games. And those cases were rampant in the US and UK. So between hobby wargaming and serious wargaming, there were really a lot of communications or mutual flow of people. And on the other hand, in Germany, a board game is very prevalent, and there are many war game developers in the civilian sector, I understand. So the community, and I understand Dr. Verbovszky is developing a serious war game or contributing to the serious war game community. And in Germany, how do you collaborate with the civilian sector hobby war gamers, and what kind of challenges do you have in working together with them? Because at NIDS, for example, computer gaming is a lot popular in the civilian society, and how to bridge between hobby and serious wargaming is one question for us to consider in the future. So I'd like to know what kind of challenges you face in Germany and how you're trying to respond.
Thank you for your question. There's very limited cooperation between hobby wargaming and actual military wargaming in Germany. We have probably some of the best board game builders in the world. Many of the German board gamers win awards every year. But to give you an example of how little cooperation we have, we had our German Wargaming Symposium, so German Connections, from the 22nd until the 24th of October. And during roughly the same time, there was the Essen Spielmesse, which is the largest board gaming conference worldwide. There was no overlap in attendance. So that kind of gives you an idea that there's very little cooperation, but some board game developers do work together with the Bundeswehr, so we do have that. And what is also important is I think computer gaming is also extremely relevant. The Americans do a much better job of integrating both the board gaming community, the Dungeons and Dragons community, and the computer gaming industry into sort of professional military exercises in comparison to Germany, definitely. And it's quite interesting, but what I think would help is, and this is something we're looking into, is how to phrase the question. So we model our wargaming approach on the scientific method, so saying, okay, what is our research question, or what is our objective, our learning objective? Then we set up a hypothesis. Then we create an experiment design, in this case a wargame design, and then we would, try to see if it produces the results we're looking for, or if we have to change the design or the question. And if you apply that same approach to existing computer games or board games, and you say, what question do we want to get out of this? Like, do we want to observe something in the behavior of our participants? Do we want to see if they achieve certain results? If you know what questions you're after, you can actually use many of these commercial war games, commercial board games, or computer games to answer these questions. So we don't have to start from scratch. We don't even really need to create custom designs if we know what questions we're asking. So that's usually how we do it, is we look at, okay, what are we investigating? Do we want to investigate how people are developing better strategic thinking? Then which games could we use? Is there something? Always look to see what is available. Sometimes having cost constraints is helpful. If we look at Germany with the Versailles Treaty, They used wargaming to figure out many problems. They actually used the restrictions to their advantage. So actually having constraints sometimes is helpful in learning that you have more than you thought you did. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? No more questions? Thank you very much. It's a little bit early, but since we have already handled many questions, we would like to wrap up the second session. Now, to the two speakers, please give them a round of applause.